Hi, this is Gail Sokol. On today's show, we're going to talk about how to make the perfect apple pie.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So we're learning how to make the perfect apple pie today. And the first thing we want to do is we've got to make that flaky pie crust. Because a pie in general, especially a fruit pie, is a combination of the flakiest pie crust and the most beautiful, spice-flecked filling with fresh fruit or almost any type of fruit. You can make many different types of fruit pies. And today we're going to focus on apples because I love apple pie. This is going to make one 9-inch double crusted pie. And when you hear the word double crusted, you're going to think bottom crust and top crust. And not all apple pies or not all pies in general have a bottom and a top crust. Some of them only have a bottom crust, and they may have a streusel topping. So you'd put the bottom crust in, the fruit, and then you would have a streusel, sort of a mixture, a melange of butter and flour and spices and sugar, and sprinkle that on top. Or you can do another crust on the top, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So what I'd like to first start with is making this flaky pie crust, and I call it a pâte brisée. That's the official term, and it means broken pie crust or broken pastry because it is that flaky. It's going to break apart when you put your fork in it, and that to me is, I know I've done something right when I put my fork into a pie and I can see the flakiness of that pie crust. So the first thing you're going to do is get a medium-sized bowl. Do not get a small bowl, get a medium-sized bowl, one that you can really work with. And I'm going to put in 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Remember, all-purpose flour is a flour that has just enough protein content that it's not going to create a very tough pastry, but it's good for many purposes. So you could make even a pizza crust or a bagel out of all-purpose flour. Although there are other specialty flours that have more protein content, we would really like to minimize the protein content because we want little gluten in our pie crust. We want our pie crust to be flaky and break apart relatively easily. So 2 cups of all-purpose flour and 1 teaspoon of salt. Use table salt. Don't use kosher salt. Too large a crystal, and it may not evenly distribute throughout the flour. And then you're going to take this special tool, and everyone's thinking, I don't have it. I may not have it. Well, don't worry. It's called a pastry blender, and if you don't have it, you can do this many, many ways. So a pastry blender almost looks like a stirrup. Like when you ride a horse, you put your foot in that stirrup thing. It almost reminds me of that. It's a handle. It can be plastic or wood, and it's attached to loops of metal. And they are usually not sharp, but they can be a little sharp depending on the type you buy. And it's a way to blend your ingredients together when making a flaky pie crust. If you don't have one, a fork and a knife works perfectly well, and you can even do this in the food processor. But you have to be careful, and I'll explain why. The next thing you're going to do, I use my pastry blender to mix my flour and salt. I actually use it to sort of almost whisk it together. And if you see a pastry blender, it almost looks like an elongated whisk-like thing with the metal loops, almost like a whisk. Once you have your flour and salt evenly blended together, you're going to put in 1.5 sticks. That's also equivalent to 3/4 of a cup or 12 tablespoons of unsalted butter. And the butter should be cut into small cubes and very cold. Sometimes I store my butter in the freezer for like a half hour to an hour to get it super cold. And the reason we want to do this, that's the key to flakiness, a super cold butter. And if we don't have a super cold butter, we're not going to have a super flaky pie crust, and I'll explain as we go on. So you're going to add these small cubes of butter into your flour mixture, and you're going to start using your pastry blender. And this is known as cutting in the fat. A lot of recipes will say, cut your fat into your flour mixture, meaning your flour and your salt. And a lot of people will say, well, what does that mean? I have students in my culinary classes saying, what does cut mean? Cut means you're just sort of rolling that pastry blender against the bottom of the bowl, and you're trying to cut those butter pieces into fine, fine little pieces. And when you make a flaky pie crust, the key is not to thoroughly combine the fat with the flour. This is the key. I hope you're listening. This is the key, the tip, the major tip. You want to cut your flour and your fat together only until the fat is pea-sized. Teeny little vegetable-sized peas. That's all you want. And then you stop. All right? You don't want to keep going. Some people have so much fun with this pastry blender, and they keep cutting the fat into the flour, and they end up with almost the butter mixed in completely. The other problem is when you use a pastry blender, you're actually creating friction. Friction creates heat. Heat melts butter. And butter is glorious, but it's got to be cold in this case. And I should also note, you don't have to use butter. A lot of pastry crusts use lard, which is fat rendered from hogs. In Mexican cuisine, there's a lot of lard used. And in the old days, before the saturated fat was discovered in lard and how unhealthy it was, many people used lard for their pie crust. And I think it was probably a lot flakier. Vegetable shortenings will also produce a lot of flakiness. But butter, I feel, tastes the best. So try mine and see if you like it. If you want to substitute half butter and half shortening, you can do that. You can also keep your shortening in the refrigerator and keep it ice cold, or even freeze it for a little while. So once you have your pea-sized pieces, it almost looks oatmeal-y, like a little bowl of oatmeal in a way. You're going to add a little bit of water, but the water has to be ice water. So you're going to have ice cubes and just put a bunch of water in with the ice cubes. Don't even measure it at this point. Put it in like a liquid measuring cup so you can pour, and it's got a nice spout, or even a little pitcher. And pour out about 1/4 cup. And you want to measure this accurately. And then put your pastry blender down. I had a student once, this is no joke, during a baking class in culinary school, and he kept his pastry blender and he kept mixing his water in with the cut fat and flour mixture, and he ended up, it almost looked like paste, actually paste. So that was a pie crust we could not use. He was really overdeveloping the gluten-forming proteins in there, and he was melting his butter because it produced a lot of friction. So don't do that. So now you're going to take maybe a small spoon, maybe a rubber spatula or a wooden spoon, or even your good old best tools, your hands, and add that ice water slowly and gently mix your ingredients together. It should form a ball of dough or a mass of dough at this point. If you don't like the way it looks and it really flakes apart and it's super dry, go ahead and add a little more ice water, but don't add warm water. It must be ice cold. So that's why I don't measure that. I make a big amount knowing I may need more. Once you get into a mass where you can actually hold it together and bring it together, you want to take a large piece of plastic wrap, put this ball of dough into the piece of plastic wrap. Don't leave it in the bowl. Clean the bowl out so all the flour particles, everything is gathered together. And then you're going to wrap it in plastic wrap. And at this point, I flatten it with my hand. I don't do it unless the plastic wrap is over it. And I flatten it to maybe a 1-inch thick disc. Don't worry about the shape of it yet. You try to make it circular if you can, because my pie pan is circular. So if you're going to be using a circular pie pan, and most of us do, you would want that in a circular shape. So I will take this pie crust now, and we want to let it relax because we've sort of beat it up a little bit. And I don't mean that literally, but we did develop some gluten-forming proteins. We took the proteins that are in that flour, and if you remember, all-purpose flour is made from the wheat plant. It comes from the wheat plant, so it does have gluten in it and gluten-forming proteins. And the way you form gluten-forming proteins is if you mix the flour with water. It doesn't form unless water is in the mix. The good thing is we have so much butter, it will counteract that development of gluten, and we're going to end up with a nice flaky pie crust. So once you have this plastic wrapped dough ready to go, you're going to put it in your refrigerator and you're going to let it chill for up to an hour, maybe 2 hours. You don't want it rock hard, but you do want the butter to go back to a cold state. Or if you're in a hurry, you can put it in your freezer for about a half hour. And better yet, if you're trying to do things ahead, like I love to do, I like to make all my pastries ahead, date them, label them, put the plastic wrapped dough into a Ziploc bag or some sort of a plastic bag that you can seal and put it in your freezer. So whenever you feel like, I have a yen for pie, I'd like to make a pie. You can just take out whatever you want, put it in your refrigerator, and within several hours, you can have your own pie crust. It's already made. It's a lot better than the processed stuff. So once our pie crust is now relaxing in the refrigerator, we're now going to make our filling. So we're going to make an apple pie. And the first thing you want to do, a lot of people don't do this. I don't want to say properly, but there's a way to do it that you can mix your dry ingredients and then you put your apples in after. And the reason you want to do this is if you have a bowl of sliced apples, which you want to have a bowl of sliced apples, you put let's say you put your cinnamon in, and then you put some ginger in, and then you put some sugar in. Only a few slices of apples will be coated with cinnamon or ginger. Every other apple will not have them. It'll be much more hard to distribute those spices if you just dump them in with the apples directly. So they need something to buffer them, and that would be the sugar and the flour. So in a separate small bowl, you're going to take 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. And make sure it's granulated sugar. You don't want to use any other type of sugar like powdered sugar. It just really wouldn't work here. Granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour, and that's going to be our thickening agent. That's going to help our pie juices get thick enough that they make this beautiful, almost like gel, spiced flavored gel. Then you're going to add cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. And I love those combinations. 1/2 teaspoon of each. So that's ground cinnamon, ground nutmeg, and ground ginger. And at this point, if you say, you know what, I happen to have some dried cranberries, or I happen to have some crystallized ginger, or dates, or nuts, or raisins, and you want to put a 1/2 cup in there, throw them in. Toss this mixture around, and then in another larger bowl, you want to have 6 cups of thinly sliced, peeled, and pared apples. Okay. Everyone will always ask, and I bet you're asking right now, what type of apples should I use? You know what? It really doesn't matter. It's whatever apples you love. So if you found some great apples in the grocery store, or you went picking apples, your own apples, anything will work. I love Granny Smith's because they are tart, a little combination of tartness and the sweetness from the spices and the sugar. I love that combination, but you can also add anything you want, from Crispins to Galas to Macintosh, anything you want, John O'Golds, whatever. And if you have 1 or 2 apples of each type, you can combine them. You can mix. There's no apple police telling you can't do that. So definitely make a combination of about 6 cups. And you want to make sure you get all the peel off, and you want to make sure you core them. I remember once biting into an apple pie that one of my relatives made that shall remain nameless, and it was full of core. And that is uncomfortable to chew on a piece of core or even an apple seed. So you don't want someone to choke. So you want to make sure those are all removed, and you want to thinly slice it, not paper thin, but you want to slice those apples between maybe 1/8 and 1/4 inch thick. So those are going to be in one bowl. And when they're all sliced, pour your spice and sugar mixture over them, and with a slotted spoon, that's a big old spoon that's got some holes in it or slits in it, and that will help blend everything together. If you don't have a slotted spoon, sometimes I use my hands. Again, I can actually feel each apple being coated with that spice and sugar blend, and I just think it works out really well. Now, you're going to notice something. Don't get upset. After several minutes, you're going to see some liquid go to the bottom of the bowl and form on the bottom of the bowl. And you're going to think, I didn't add any liquid. What is going on here? Well, that's basically osmosis happening. So this is the scientist in me. I love some baking science, and I'm not going to throw in too much. I don't want to scare you away, but what's happening is the apples are mostly water. The sugar has no water in it, and apples or water-based things tend to go from a higher concentration of themselves to a lower concentration to try to even out the concentrations. So the juices from the apple are going to sort of pass through the semi-permeable membranes of the apples, go into the spices, and sort of make them almost saucy. Not really liquidy, but a little saucier than they were before. And don't worry, that's fine. We can drain that out, and that's what that slotted spoon is for, because that will drain out any liquid. So, you ready to bake pie? Before I get started, there's one other tip I wanted to tell you. If you see a recipe and it says use 2 pounds of apples and you don't have a scale, good rule of thumb, 1 pound of apples is about 3 medium apples. And nowadays, there are apples as big as your head, and there are apples that are smaller than that. So it really depends on what you have. But you want about 6 cups in general. So 1 pound equals about 3 medium. All right, you ready to make pie? All right, here we go. So our pie crust has been chilling, and it's gotten sort of firm, but you don't want it hard as a rock or you won't be able to roll it out. So if it is hard as a rock, take it out of your refrigerator now while you're getting all your mise en place or getting all your other ingredients and tools together, and let it sit out at room temperature for a few minutes, and preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is a pretty high temperature. Most pies, if you're a pie baker, bake at a high temperature. And let me explain very quickly what's going to happen to the crust when it goes into the oven. And this ties back to why the butter has to be cold and the water has to be icy cold. So when you have your crust rolled out, you're going to see little baby hunks of butter in there, or fat, whatever fat you've used, whether it's lard or vegetable shortening. And these fat particles are absolutely crucial to the flakiness of our pie crust. Crucial. So once they go into the oven, what's the fat going to do? At 425, they're going to melt. And you know what? Anything would melt at that temperature. So the fat's going to melt, and it's going to form what I call spacers, little tiny spaces where they once were. These little fat particles were, these little pea-sized pieces of fat were. And the fat itself, the beautiful flavor from that fat, is going to melt into your dough, your beautiful dough. And it's going to leave these little pockets of space. And that space is going to fill with air or water. And because there's water in our pie crust, remember, we did add some water, and there's even water in butter. And that water, what's it going to do? It's going to turn to steam. And that steam, believe it or not, is one of the most powerful leaveners that bakers love. It really can puff up on the layers of dough above and below where those spacers were, creating flakiness. Get it? Flakiness. That's the whole purpose of making this pie. So we have a beautiful, tender crust, but we also want it flaky. And that means it separates those little tiny layers, those thin layers of dough and fat are going to separate. And that's because of these little spacers. So now we're going to roll out our pastry crust. This is where a lot of people have trouble, and this is where a lot of people are frightened of making a pie. And I've really heard from a lot of people that are so scared of baking pies in general because they say, my pie crust, they're a disaster. They don't come out. So there's many tips that you can actually do to prevent any mishaps from happening. First thing you want to do is get a work surface that's smooth, whether it's a giant cutting board. Put a moistened kitchen towel underneath it to stabilize it, or use a marble slab. I love to use a marble slab if you happen to have one, and that's like a slab of marble made specifically for pie crusts and pastry in general, and it stays cold. And that's, again, you want your pastry to stay cold. You need flour. So you're going to get a little cupful of all-purpose flour and a spoon, and you're going to sprinkle your work surface like it's snowing. You're going to put a nice base of flour down, and then you're going to take a knife or a dough scraper or a dough cutter. This is a wonderful tool that will cut your dough in half, and it's also a great thing. They call it a bench scraper because your work surface is also known as the workbench. And you can take this particular tool and scrape excess flour or dough off your workbench when you want to clean it. But I use it to cut things as well. It's sort of a metal piece that's not that sharp, and it's attached to a handle. And you can get them in any type of a kitchen supply store. Very good tool to have. So you're going to cut your dough in half. You're going to place one half, rewrap it in that plastic wrap, and put it back in the refrigerator because you want to make sure it stays cold. So the other half is going to be your bottom crust. And you should get your pie pan ready. This should be a 9-inch pie pan. And do not grease it. You don't have to spray it with anything. You don't have to do anything with it. There's enough fat in here that pie will come out. So you do want to take your pie tin or your pie pan, whatever you're using, and they come in so many beautiful colors and shapes. So use whatever you want, deep dish, not deep dish. It doesn't matter. They're all good. And put it on the side. You're going to need it because we need to measure our pie crust to make sure that it's large enough. And take a rolling pin. Now, rolling pins, I'm very particular about my rolling pins. Okay, I think I'm a rolling pin snob. I really am. It's embarrassing. But I don't like the ones with the handles. I like the French rolling pins. They sort of taper on either end, and they don't have handles, so to speak, and or handles per se, but I love the way they feel, and I can roll very easily with them. If you like the ones with the handles, that's fine, each to their own. There's nothing wrong with those. And you want to flour your rolling pin. Actually take some flour and roll it around the rolling pin. Now you're going to take that half a dough, and before you even roll it out, gently get it into a round shape. Do not overhandle it because your hands are warm, right? They're about 98.6 degrees, and that type of warmth will melt your butter. That will very much so destroy our flakiness, so we don't want to do that. So you want to start rolling out your pastry by sprinkling the top of it with flour and roll maybe once or twice, and then rotate. Rotate your pie crust so that maybe 45 degrees, either direction, it doesn't matter, and keep rolling it 2 or 3 times and then rotate. And you'll notice it will become circular in shape. If you keep rolling it out without moving it, 2 things will happen. You're going to get very funky shapes like the state of Texas, or really non-circular shapes that are not helpful to you and your pie making. And the other thing is, eventually, that pie crust is going to stick to that work surface, and you don't want that. That's a good way to tear your pie crust. So you want to keep everything floured, and you want to keep it moving. So roll 2 or 3 times and rotate. Roll, rotate, roll, rotate. And then you should, at this point, after many times of doing this, you should have about maybe a 10 to 11 inch diameter circle. Now, is it going to be a perfect circle? No one's going to have a perfect circle. Don't worry about it. We're going to be cutting the excess off. But your pie pan has sides. So it's not just a 2-dimensional 9 inches in diameter. So we have to take into consideration that it has sides. And the deeper the pan, the larger that circle of crust should be. So I usually go about 11 inches, maybe so that it's about 1 inch over the edge of my pie pan. And I take my pie pan I put it upside down over my circular piece of dough, and I measure, is it maybe an inch or two beyond that diameter? If it is, take a small knife or even a pizza wheel and just cut around it so it leaves about 1 to 2 inches of excess dough all around. Don't cut it the exact size of your pie pan. You won't have enough. So once you've done that, you're going to have a big circle, bigger than your pie pan, okay? Put your pie pan right side up now, and you're going to take your pie crust, which is now a nice circle. All right, it's going to be a little rough around the edges, but don't worry about that. And if you have a pastry brush, like a little brush you can brush off excess flour, that's a good time now to sort of brush it off. And pastry brushes are really cool to have as well. We're going to use them for another part of egg washing our apple pie when we're ready to go into the oven. So you're going to brush all the excess flour off, and then you're going to fold your pie crust. Some people, a lot of people do this. My grandmother used to do this. They'll roll the pie crust over their rolling pin and roll it right onto into their pie pan. And I don't like doing this. Sometimes it rips. Sometimes it can be very delicate. So if you don't want to do that, don't worry about it. I'll give you a better way to do it. Take your pie crust, put it in half. Just fold it in half. And it's not going to stick together. Don't worry about it. Roll it in half. Fold it in half and then fold it in quarters. And at this point, your pie crust should not be that thick. All right. It should be relatively thin, maybe a 1/4 of an inch thick, no thicker than that. And then you're going to take the point of that quartered pie crust, almost like you took a circle and put it into quarters, which is exactly what you did. And you're going to put the tip of that pie crust into the middle of your pie pan, and you're going to slowly unfold it. And you're going to see it's going to fit in beautifully. And yes, it's going to hang over the edges. So don't get upset. We know this already, right? We expect that. And we want that. That's a good thing. So I'd rather have too much dough than too little. And at this point, this is where things can get a little hairy. So you want to be super gentle and you want to fit your pie crust into the pie pan. You don't want to rip it. You don't want to tear it. And you certainly want to be gentle. So if you're not gentle with it, it can shrink in the oven. If you pull on it, it gets them a little stretched out and then they boing like a rubber band in the oven. So you don't want them to shrink. So you want to unfold this gently, put it into your pan, gently just feed it in so it's completely nicely fitted into your pie pan. So you have a beautiful bottom crust, right? Which hangs over the edges. Don't touch those. Leave that alone. Now take your filling, and at this point, your filling is probably got some liquid on the bottom of it. Okay, remember that osmosis we talked about before with the apples? Don't worry about it. Take your slotted spoon and gently take spoonfuls of apple and put them into the crust. Just put them into the crust, and you want to push them down with your hands because you want to pack these apples down, or else sometimes you can have apples that, because they are made of water, they'll shrink in the oven even more, and you'll end up with air pockets. And I like my apple pie full of apples, no air. So you want to push down those apples as you're spooning them in and leave the liquid in the bowl. Enough of the spices will get attached to the apples along with the flour and sugar. Don't worry about it. It's going to be delicious. And you'll notice that your apples will look like, they're sort of coated with spices, which is wonderful. And if you have raisins or chopped up crystallized ginger in here, wonderful, beautiful. Mix those in as well. So pack everything in, get all your filling in there, and then leave your juices just throw out those juices. You don't need them. If you wanted to put a tablespoon of juices in, that's fine, but I wouldn't do any more. That is going to make a very wet, mushy pie, and we don't like mushy pies. Now, at this point, if you want to enrich your pie and make it, just sort of give it that little something extra, you might want to take 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter and just sort of take a little knife and cut little bits of butter and scatter them over the apple slices on the top. I don't always do this, but if you want to make a special, like a special apple pie, not like it doesn't have enough butter in it already, put a little bit of these butter pieces on top, very tiny little pieces, maybe 1/4 inch little bits, and it really doesn't matter as long as they're tiny, and scatter them around. And it just gives it that little something extra. And butter's always a very nice flavor. So now put that aside and re-flour your work surface again, because now we're going to do it again. All right. We're going to do it again with the top crust. So go get your top crust out of the refrigerator, and it's still going to be nice and cold. And you're going to re-flour that work surface. Make sure it has enough flour, and don't be skimpy on the flour. If you are skimpy, it will stick. And this is the top crust, remember. This is the part that really you want to be beautiful. You want it pretty. So at this point, we're going to roll it out again, just like we did with the bottom, until it's about 1 inch or 2 larger than the diameter of your pie pan. And at this point, you're not going to be able to take your pie pan and put it upside down to measure it. So sometimes I just eyeball it, or I'll just take my pie that's filled with apples now and just sort of hover it over my crust to sort of eyeball it and see, estimate. Is it about the right size? Yeah, it's fine. Now at this point, I can put my pie crust into quarters and lay it on top over the buttery apples. I can do that, or I can make some decorative cuts on the top at this point. So sometimes I'll go get my little cookie cutters, and I'll take some leaves, or I'll get an apple cookie cutter and just cut out a little apple. You do need a steam escape. You need some way for steam to escape. So whatever you do, whether it's slits in the top of the apple, the top crust of the apple pie, or you want to make something a little prettier. And I will give you an idea, which is sort of a cool thing to do. So if you don't have an apple cookie cutter, you can just sort of rough out a round cutout on top. Just make it with a small, sharp knife and take that piece of pastry out, and then maybe cut with some of the excess dough that you have, cut out a little stem, and you can bake that separately if you want, or you can take a little bit of egg yolk, mix it with some food coloring, like red food coloring, and paint it with a little pastry brush over that apple cookie cutter and the apple shape, and it will be red, and the egg yolk will hold that color in. So when it bakes, it'll just look like you have like a little apple on top of your pie. It's sort of cool. And then I'll take some green food coloring on the leaves or the stem. But if you don't want to get fancy schmancy, don't worry. Just put this pie into quarters, lay it evenly over the top of your filled pie. And then if you want, just make a few slits. You can make them in each quadrant. So, in quarters, just make, or any type of slit that you want, as long as the steam can escape. Now we have to do something about that excess dough. There's a lot of dough here. So you're going to take your little paring knife, or even a little kitchen scissors, and you're going to cut around so you have maybe 1/2 inch excess dough, top and bottom, all around the pie, 360 degrees all around. And take that excess dough, and you can either make other cutouts that you can bake off separately. What I love to do is sort of cinnamon sugar those with a little egg wash and bake them and have them for snacks, or put them on baked apples for other desserts. So that's sort of fun to do. Now you're going to make an egg wash. So we're going to take 1 egg, and we're going to mix it with a little water, about a teaspoon of water. Doesn't have to be hot or cold, just room temperature water. And you're going to put your pastry brush in there, or whisk that first with a little bit of a fork, maybe. I just whisk it with my pastry brush. And pull your 2 crusts apart and just sort of egg wash in between. All right, so before that top crust goes on, you can just egg wash the edges of that pie all the way around. This will be our glue. And then you're going to glue the top crust to the bottom crust, because you don't want anything to open up at this point. And now this is the fun part. This is the most fun of apple pie making, as far as I'm concerned, is crimping the sides. So you can take 2 fingers and you can actually make sort of like these little loops all the way around, like folds. So it sort of looks like it's fluted all the way around. Or you can just take a fork and fork the edges. But before you do that, turn under that. Remember I said leave about excess of 1/2 inch. Fold the top and bottom crusts together, push them together, and then fold them under, almost like you're cuffing a pant leg. And do that all the way around. So this will enclose all the apples inside. And then you can either take your fork and make some decorative crimping around or use your fingers to do that. You already have your slits, so you're ready to go. And then just sort of get all your crust pushed down slightly, just gently push down on your crust on top. And then egg wash the entire pie. Oh yeah, egg wash the entire pie. And there's a method to my madness, because now we're going to sugar this thing. We're going to take some extra granulated sugar. You can even take turbinado sugar. Have you ever heard of that? That's sort of sugar that's not as refined. It has a little molasses in it, and it's got a larger crystal, and it's beautiful. And you can find it in any grocery store, or you can just use granulated sugar, and I've done both. And you just sort of scatter and sprinkle sugar all over the entire pie. Oh yeah, the entire pie. And don't be skimpy with the sugar, because it really helps to caramelize the top. And what also will help it brown is the egg yolk in that egg wash. So you've crimped, you've egg washed, you've sugared. Now we're ready to bake. Your oven is 425 degrees Fahrenheit, a beautiful temperature for any pie. And before you put that pie in the oven, here's another tip. And it's a really important one. Don't ever put your pie in the oven unless it's on a sheet pan, a large sheet pan. I hope you're listening to me, because if you put a pie into an oven without any sheet pan, it's just hanging out on the rack, two things can happen. Sometimes the apple or whatever fruit filling it is, and if it's blueberry, that's a really hard thing to clean out of the bottom of an oven. It can overflow. It bubbles, and you do want your fruit juices to bubble up through those slits, and they'll bubble over, and they'll actually bubble over onto the bottom of your oven. And that is so much fun to clean up that I don't want to ever do it again. So make sure you put your pie on an aluminum foil lined baking sheet or even a pizza pan. This will also prevent you and your oven mitt from squishing your beautiful pie as you're, entering it into the oven or taking it out of the oven. So you really want to make sure that you don't touch this pie, manhandle this pie with your hands. You want to touch the baking sheet only. So you're going to put it in the middle rack. If you want it to not get as brown as quickly and you want that bottom crust to brown nicely, put it in the bottom rack. But you've got to be careful. It depends upon what your pie pan is made of. So if it's dark, your pie pan, it's really, really dark like aluminum, you don't want to put it on the bottom. That's going to absorb a lot of heat. If it's glass like Pyrex, I'd put it on the bottom, but it can also attract a lot of heat. And some of these really pretty ceramic pie pans, just put it in the middle rack, just to be safe. Some ovens run hot, so you have to be careful when you're baking a pie. So at this point, you are going to shut the oven door. All right, say goodbye to your pie, because by the time it comes out, it's going to be gorgeous. And you're going to put your oven timer on for 40 minutes, 40. You're not going to peek. You're not going to look. You're not going to do anything unless you have a window and you have oven lights. Then I give you permission to look. But you really don't want to open that oven door until about 40 minutes. After 40 minutes, you're going to make a determination. Okay, this pie is getting very brown, and that's because of the sugar sprinkled on the top. So you may want to cover it with a piece of aluminum foil. And I don't mean tightly. I mean just gently set it over the pie. It's already baked. It's already set. The structure has set. And you just want to get maybe a little more baking in, maybe another 10 minutes or so to make it a total of 50 minutes. But if it's nice and dark already and the fruit is bubbling through the slits, you got yourself a ready baked apple pie. Take it out of the oven. even after 40 minutes. Sometimes it happens where my oven seems to be running hot that day and it's ready to come out. So take it out, and you don't want to eat that hot of an apple pie, although it's tempting. Let it cool down to room temperature or even warm, and then get out the ice cream or the whipped cream. You got yourself a delicious apple pie. On today's show, we talked about how to make the perfect apple pie. And if you have any questions, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air and find out how you like this apple pie recipe. I really am interested. On next week's show, we're going to be discussing eggs.